So we've put together some interesting case studies, and the idea here is that by having transparency into the supply chain, different types of opportunities emerge. So we've looked at what we can learn from looking at hospitals, dog and cat food manufacturing, beer, and shoes. And rather than explaining now what all of the different insights are, let's just dive right in and discover the insights together. Let's start with hospitals. Before I tell you what the supply chain mapping reveals, I'd like to ask the audience, what do you think the hotspots are? So when I first think of a hospital, I might imagine certainly electricity seems like something that would be a big part of the footprint. You can imagine everyone's using electricity, all the lights are on, and there's machines running in the hospital, so that makes sense. There's lots of paper products being purchased and maybe plastic goods for medical equipment. So those seem to me like they might be the hotspots. So let's see how I did, and you can see how you did on what you guessed. So this graph, let me just take a minute to explain this graph. This graph is basically showing the top 90% of greenhouse gas emissions contributors to a hospital's carbon footprint across its supply chain. And we've broken each bar of this graph into the 6 categories of greenhouse gases as specified by the Kyoto Protocol. So I won't go into details on what each gas is, but the idea is that we're showing essentially CO2 or carbon dioxide equivalent emissions, except that there are multiple gases that also behave like carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So we're representing all of them in this graph. Okay, so now let's see how we did in identifying hotspots. Well, certainly electricity is the biggest hitter, so we did a good job there. And here we've circled what looks to be mostly kind of medical equipment and supplies. So there are gases, there is certainly sanitary paper, we have various chemicals and drugs, pharmaceuticals, plastics products. So we're seeing that we were correct in guessing that electricity and gases were the big part of the footprint. And these are things that probably would have been included in a standard carbon footprint analysis. But what's really interesting, that surprised me when I had the opportunity to dig into this data, is that food emerges as a big part of the footprint. And it makes sense in hindsight, but it's not something that if you were going into a hospital to do their carbon footprint, you wouldn't immediately think, oh, we need to look at how much meat they're buying and go back into the supply chain and analyze a meat's carbon footprint. But meat emerges as a big part of the footprint, and cheese and ice cream. You can imagine people eating ice cream at the end of their meal every day and how that adds up to a big part of the carbon footprint. So we'll look into food in the next section and see how you could make decisions about suppliers or sourcing to try to reduce the footprint. But for now, the insight is simply that because of transparency and because we used a comprehensive method to look at everything that contributed to the carbon footprint of a hospital, we gained insight on an area that probably would have been missed otherwise. This is exciting. Before I move on, I want to make the point that many people say that it's possible to figure out what the big hitters are by simply looking at spend. So you can say, well, this is where I'm spending all my money, so this is where my biggest footprint must be. And this isn't always exactly correct. So this graph is showing 2 bars for each of the categories we just saw. One bar shows spend, and the other bar shows total greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see that they don't really scale together. So not much money is being spent on electricity relative to the huge amount of emissions that are coming from purchases of electricity. And then conversely, a lot of money is being spent on real estate, but not so much emissions are coming from real estate purchases. And so it's important to do these kinds of screenings where you use a database that converts dollar spend into an estimate of greenhouse gas emissions, and then that is what can actually provide the screening analysis and the hotspots analysis that provides further insights. So now that we've shown how transparency can provide insight into new or missed opportunities, let's look at dog and cat food. And in this case, we'll see how going a step beyond transparency, you can start to envision a supplier strategy that emerges from transparency. So again, we'd like to give you the opportunity to guess the hotspots. when I first thought about dog and cat food manufacturing, and this is coming from a perspective of knowing pretty much nothing about dog and cat food manufacturing, it seemed to me that packaging might be the biggest part of the footprint, and I could imagine that multi-layered packaging with different kinds of plastics that you can't recycle would be a really big problem, and that likely I could imagine a company spending a lot of time and money redesigning their packaging or coming up with different boxes or using recycled cardboard. And so that's what I would expect to be the biggest part of the footprint. Turns out I was wrong. If you actually do this analysis and you look at the hotspots for dog and cat food manufacturing, we see that grain emerges as over 30% of the carbon footprint for dog and cat food. And this is really interesting. So it's grain, meat is the next biggest hitter, and then soy. And so we're seeing that it's really the constituents that make up the food that are the biggest part of the footprint. And now we can go back another level by because this input-output database allows us to go back an infinite number of levels into the supply chain, we can dig into grain and see what is causing it to be a big part of the footprint. And we see that the kind of direct emissions that are coming from producing the grain are now the biggest bubble. And I should say that all of these bubbles are to scale. So each bubble represents quantity of greenhouse gas emissions, and it's mathematically accurate. So when you see that the kind of direct emissions bubble for grain is the biggest bubble, that is accurate, and it's about the same size as the meat total supply chain bubble here. Okay, so now that we know that for some reason grain direct emissions are the biggest part of the footprint, we can go back to the greenhouse gas bar chart that I showed before and try to understand why that is and if there's any insight we can gain from that. So looking at this chart, we see that nitrous oxide release from fertilizer use is the biggest contributor to grain's carbon footprint. So that's interesting. So because grain is using fertilizer, it's the biggest part of the footprint. So then does that mean that if we could choose suppliers with low fertilizer use, then we could reduce our carbon footprint? Perhaps. And this provides us with insight into supplier selection, and it provides insight into what questions you might want to ask your supplier. So rather than going to all of your possible grain suppliers and asking them all to do a comprehensive carbon footprint, because we've identified what the key part of the footprint is, we can ask a simple question to help us make decisions. And here we can then start to compare different suppliers against each other and identify how to reduce the total carbon footprint of dog and cat food. So now that we've seen how transparency and carbon mapping can provide insight into supplier selection, let's look at beer. And in beer, a different insight emerges. It emerges around packaging. So we'll dive right in now to the bubbles. And you can see that metal cans and glass bottles, and once again, grain is a big part of the footprint. But because we've already discussed grain and how that leads to opportunities for supplier selection, let's focus on the metal cans and glass bottles portion of beer. So we can dig into each of these one at a time, and we can look back into the supply chain of cans, for example, and we see that aluminum clearly is the biggest part of the footprint, which is interesting because this tells us that perhaps we could be sourcing recycled aluminum, or we can redesign our packaging to use less aluminum. When we look back into glass bottles, we see that actually it's electricity use in the production of the glass bottles that is the biggest part of the carbon footprint. And so now the goal is really to either think about if there's new ways to manufacture to reduce electricity, or if we can just redesign the packaging to use less glass to reduce the carbon footprint. So the moral of the story here is that aluminum, glass, and cardboard, which I didn't discuss before but emerges in the kind of the top 6 or 7 of the hotspots for beer, aluminum, glass, and cardboard are the biggest part of the footprint. And there's opportunities then for packaging redesign to reduce the carbon footprint of beer, rather than trying to redo the constituents of the beer itself as the method for reducing greenhouse gas emissions.